Close your eyes and imagine it. A wooden giant, floating silently on a sea of silver. It creaks like an old cathedral, but this cathedral moves, and it breathes with the pulse of 800 men. This is HMS Victory. Before she became legend, she was nothing more than a dreamer of oak and ambition. When she was launched in 1765, no one knew she would live to see cannon smoke at Trafalgar, or still stand centuries later anchored in Portsmouth like a relic of an age. When the ocean decided the fate of empires, the 18th century warship wasn't just a vessel. It was a world, an entire society folded neatly inside a hull of timber and tar. There were streets, kitchens, prisons, hospitals, even tiny chapels carved into corners where the air was thick with salt and prayer. To understand HMS Victory, you have to think in layers. Not decks, but layers of human life, from the polished brass on the captain's table to the sweat-stained ropes of the powder boys. The air aboard smelled of everything: oak pitch, wet hemp, and men who hadn't seen dry land in months. Lanterns flickered in the corridors, their glow bending against curved planks. Each creak and whisper meant something: a signal, a warning, or just the ship reminding her crew that she was very much alive. A warship like Victory began in the forests. Thousands of oak trees were felled, each one older than the men who would serve aboard her. The best timber came from England's royal forests, chosen not for beauty but for the shape of the grain. Some trees were bent by wind in just the right way to fit the curve of the whole. Builders said that if you listened carefully, you could hear the forest groan when the trees fell, as if it already knew what they'd become. In the great dockyards, those timbers were stacked like bones in a giant skeleton. The builders worked by hand, measuring by eye, guided not by blueprints but by memory. Their tools, adzes, augers, mallets, had changed little since the days of Drake. Each blow of a hammer echoed across the harbor, a slow heartbeat marking the birth of a warship. When she was first launched, HMS Victory was nearly 200 feet long, with 3 masts towering more than 200 feet into the sky. She was a floating fortress, bristling with over 100 guns, from the 32-pounders that could smash through oak like paper, to the smaller 9-pounders used for precision fire. But before she fired a single shot, she had to learn how to live. Life aboard was strict, rhythmic, and endlessly noisy. The boatswain's pipe marked every hour, from dawn watch to dog watch. Each sound carried across the decks, commanding the men like a metronome of discipline. Below, in the gun decks, the world was dim and close. Hammocks swung inches apart, their canvas darkened by sweat and smoke. At night, the creak of timber and the murmur of sleep created a strange kind of lullaby, a sound that every sailor learned to love, because silence meant danger. Meals were simple: salted beef so tough it could break a tooth, biscuit crawling with weevils, and beer that was safer than water. But on Sundays, if luck or the purser allowed, there might be something resembling stew, a thin, greasy soup that still somehow felt like home. The ship was more than a machine. She was a breathing system of roles. Officers above, seamen below, marines between. The hierarchy was as solid as oak. Orders moved downward like gravity. But respect was something and sideways, between men who shared the same bruises and scars. The captain's cabin was another world entirely. Polished brass, maps drawn in ink and hope. A private gallery of glass windows where the sea shimmered like a mirror. Yet even here, comfort was an illusion. A storm could turn that elegant room into chaos within seconds. Every piece of HMS Victory was designed for both beauty and brutality. Her figurehead, a carved goddess, looked noble from afar, but she was built to take cannonballs, not compliments. Her sails, made from acres of canvas, could carry her faster than most ships dared to go. But only if the crew worked as one. Hundreds of men climbing, hauling, shouting, trusting. At sea, everything mattered. The pitch of the wind, the mood of the captain, the squeak of a pulley that might warn of rot. Survival depended not on courage alone, but on precision, on doing the right thing at the right second, even in darkness, even with death waiting over the horizon. When the bells rang for evening watch, the sea turned black, and lanterns glowed like stars trapped beneath the decks. The men sang low, rough songs about home, about rum, about nothing at all. It was the only music allowed before sleep, and somewhere above. The Victory's sails whispered through the night air, the sound that was half prayer, half promise. Because aboard this ship, every man knew that the ocean gave no second chances, and yet they chose to serve, to sleep, fight, eat, and dream inside a wooden world that could vanish with a single broadside. Morning on HMS Victory began long before the sun. The first light that reached her decks wasn't sunlight at all, but the dim glow of lanterns swinging from the beams. Somewhere deep below, a bell struck 6 slow notes. That sound meant turn out. Hammocks swayed, bodies stirred, and within moments, hundreds of men began the ritual of waking. There was no privacy. Not an inch. The average sailor's entire life fit inside one small space. His hammock, his sea chest, and his duty. He might share the deck with 200 others, each man sleeping shoulder to shoulder, head to toe, breathing the same stale air that smelled faintly of salt, tar, and humanity. By sunrise, the ship was already alive. Men scrubbed the decks with holy stones, blocks of sandstone that scoured away yesterday's grime. They knelt as they worked, pushing back and forth in rhythm. Until the planks gleamed pale and smooth, the work was endless. But the reason was simple. A clean deck meant survival. Slippery boards could cost lives in battle. Then came breakfast, if you could call it that, a ladle of oatmeal or ship's biscuit, washed down with watered beer. The food wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to keep you moving. The Navy ration was precise. 1 pound of bread, 1 pound of beef or pork, a pint of peas, and a gallon of beer per day. It sounded generous on paper, but the reality was less than glorious. Meat salted to stone, bread crawling with life. Yet the men ate, laughed, and carried on, because complaining changed nothing. Every man aboard had a job, and every job was vital. Carpenters inspected the hull, sailmakers patched the canvas, gunners polished the great bronze cannons until they shone like mirrors. Even the smallest task, like greasing the blocks or coiling the ropes, was part of a larger dance, the ceaseless rhythm of a ship at sea. And above it all stood the officers. Their world was one of crisp uniforms, measured tone, and absolute authority. The captain was more than a man. He was the law, the state, the voice of the king himself. His orders could not be questioned. To defy him was mutiny, and mutiny was death. Discipline aboard a warship was not a matter of suggestion. It was a religion. Punishment could come swiftly. 12 lashes for insolence, 36 for theft, and 100 for desertion. The bosun's mates carried the catto, 9 tails. Its leather thongs hardened with tar. Every man knew the sound it made. Every man hoped never to hear it for himself. Yet, despite the fear, there was loyalty. A strange, fierce kind of brotherhood that grew between men who lived and worked inches from one another. They sang together, fought together, bled together. The punishment was brutal, but the bond was unbreakable. On calm days, there were moments of peace. Men sat on the gun decks, mending clothes or carving bits of wood into tiny ships and hearts. Some read letters from home, worn, tear-stained scraps that smelled faintly of land. Others gambled with dice or sang sea ballads that carried through the hull like echoes of another world. But always, the ocean reminded them who was in charge. A sudden squall could strike without warning, and in seconds the calm was gone. The order came, all hands aloft. Men scrambled up the rigging, feet slipping on wet rope. Wind tearing at their clothes, 60 feet above the deck, they fought the storm, reefing sails as waves crashed below. And then, just as quickly as it came, the sea would quiet. The only sound was the creak of timbers and the sigh of canvas. Aboard Victory, even silence was alive. But beneath that quiet rhythm, the crew always knew one truth. War was never far away. Every drill, every shout, every task was practice for a moment that might come tomorrow, or never. Because when the signal flags flew and the drums began to beat, their world would change. The clean decks, the orderly routines, the laughter and song, all would vanish in a roar of cannon smoke and chaos, and that, for the men of HMS Victory, was the reality they lived with every single day. There is a saying among old sailors, a warship lives 2 lives, one in peace and one in fire, and HMS Victory was built for both. Most days at sea, she was calm, her sails billowing like lungs, her hull cutting through the waves with the slow grace of a cathedral adrift. But when the call to quarters came, everything changed. The gentle rhythm of life turned sharp. Orders barked through the decks. Boots thundered across planks within minutes. This floating city became a weapon. The men knew their places as if born to them, every soul. Aboard, from the captain to the youngest powder boy, had a rule. The gunners stood by their cannons, 32-pounders lined like beasts in a stable, each one named by the crew, Old Thunder, Black Bess, Sweet Kate. They spoke to them as if they were alive, because in a way, they were. When the drum beat rolled, the gun crews leapt into motion. It was a brutal ballet, practiced, rehearsed, perfected. A cannon wasn't just fired, it was loaded, run out, fired, and hauled back in a single, fluid rhythm. Powder boys, often no older than 12, ran from the magazine below decks, carrying black bags of gunpowder tucked against their chests. They moved fast and silent, for one spark could turn the entire ship into a coffin. The gunners swabbed the barrels with wet sponges, rammed in powder and shot, in through the gun ports, and waited. The deck beneath them trembled with every discharge. The air grew thick with smoke, so dense that men could barely see 2 feet ahead. Voices vanished. The world became sound and vibration. The thunder of cannons, the whistle of splinters, the low hum of shouted orders swallowed by chaos. Yet through that chaos, Victory held her line. Nelson's men trained not for beauty, but for precision. Every second counted. Every motion meant survival. A misfire could kill half a crew in an instant. When HMS Victory engaged her enemies, she became something unearthly. The sea's heartbeat turned into thunder. Her broadsides could shatter an enemy's hull in moments. But fighting was only half the fight. Reloading meant dragging a 3,000-pound gun back into place, while the ship pitched and rolled beneath your feet. Men worked shirtless in the choking smoke, sweat and powder streaking their skin black. The noise was relentless. You didn't hear it anymore. You felt it in your bones and above deck. The officers kept their poise. The captain stood firm, telescope in hand. Shouting through the wind, signals rippled up the masts, bright flags against dark skies. Each color meant something. Engage, turn, fire, pursue. The men trusted those flags more than the stars themselves. In battle, there was no room for fear, only action. A wounded man might be carried below to the surgeon, a grim figure working by lantern light in a chamber that stank of blood and rum. There were no anesthetics, no mercy beyond speed. Amputations took seconds. Bandages were rough linen torn from whatever could be spared. The surgeon mate poured spirits into open wounds and whispered the same words to every man. Hold fast. And above, life went on. Cannons roared, rigging snapped, sails burned. The Victory groaned like a living creature under strain. Men prayed, shouted, sang, all went silent. No one could tell how long the battle lasted. An hour could feel like a lifetime, a day like eternity. But when the smoke finally cleared, the sea was littered with wreckage, planks, ropes, floating barrels, and sometimes far worse. The survivors stood quietly at their stations, faces pale beneath layers of soot. They'd won, or lost, but either way, they were alive. And that was enough. After battle came silence, the kind of silence that only exists after chaos. The decks were washed with seawater, the wounded tended, the dead sewn into canvas shrouds. Each body was stitched with a round shot at the feet, to pull it gently beneath the waves. The ceremony was brief, but solemn. The ocean, vast and ancient, accepted them all without a sound. By nightfall, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. The stars returned, bright and cold. The men ate in weary silence, staring at the wood grain of the tables, their ears still ringing from the day's fury. Some prayed, some drank, some simply slept, hammocks swaying in rhythm with the sea's slow breath. And through it all, HMS Victory endured, scarred, scorched, but alive. Because ships, like men, are forged not by peace, but by the storms they survive. When the last echo of battle faded into the sea, HMS Victory entered a different kind of warfare, the slow, grinding campaign against time, rot, and boredom. The ocean doesn't rest. Even when men do, salt gnawed at the rigging, waves battered the hull, and everything, from cannon ropes to human patience, began to fray. For the crew, the days after combat were some of the strangest. The air still smelled of gunpowder, but the silence felt almost sacred. The men spoke in whispers, as if afraid to wake the ghosts still clinging to the timbers. Repairs began immediately. Carpenters worked without pause, hammering new planks into place, plugging holes with oakum and pitch. The smell of tar was everywhere, thick, sticky, comforting in its own way. Blackened sails were hauled down, patched, and raised again. Broken masts were cut away and replaced, ropes restrung. And every cannon checked for cracks. The ship's surgeon, still spattered with blood, walked the deck in weary silence, pausing now and then to breathe the clean air that hadn't reached his corner of hell in days. Meals returned to their dreary routine. Salted meat, hard biscuit, and grog. The men chewed in silence, listening to the creak of the ship and the slap of water against her sides. Sometimes a fiddler played. Sometimes someone sang softly about home, a farm, a wife, or a tavern that probably no longer remembered their names. The officers gathered in the wardroom, writing reports by lantern light. Their words were calm, official, detached, engaged the enemy fleet, sustained damage to mainmast, 23 killed, 40 wounded. But behind every line was a world of sound and terror that ink could never capture. Down below, life resumed its slow rhythm. The hammock swayed. The pumps groaned. Rats re-emerged, bold and curious, as if nothing had happened. The sea had its own strange mercy. It washed everything clean, even memories, if you stayed long enough. Sometimes, when the wind was still, you could hear the wood sigh. Ships breathe, in their way. They settle and flex, as though dreaming, and perhaps HMS Victory dreamed too, of quieter harbours, of green shores, of a world without thunder. But peace never lasted long. The Royal Navy's orders always came. Eventually, crisp, and cold as the parchment they were written on. Proceed to station, engage as required. The men knew the routine by heart. Repairs finished, sails tightened, powder is stocked. And once again the Victory turned her prow toward the horizon. Night on the open sea had its own strange beauty. The water glowed faintly with phosphorescence, as if starlight had spilled into the waves. The rigging hummed in the wind. The helmsman stood alone at the wheel, his eyes fixed on the compass, steering a course through a black void, somewhere below. A lantern swung gently above rows of sleeping men, an entire world contained within a wooden hull. When storms came, the sea reminded them who was in charge. The wind howled through the rigging, rain hammered the decks, and waves as tall as cathedrals crashed over the bow. Men scrambled to reef the sails, voices swallowed by the roar. The ship groaned like a wounded beast, every plank straining, every nail holding its breath. And still, she endured. The Victory was built not to yield, but to bend, to ride the storm's fury until dawn. In those moments, you understood why sailors prayed to the sea, not out of faith, but fear. The ocean was the only god that ever answered. And when morning came, the calm was almost unbearable. The sea turned glassy, the air soft. The crew emerged, bleary-eyed and soaked, to find the world reborn, sky washed clean, sails glistening, and the sun painting gold across the endless blue. For a few hours, it was paradise. A hard, fleeting kind of peace, but peace all the same. It's easy to imagine the HMS Victory as just a machine of war, timber, iron, gunpowder. But to those who lived aboard her, she was alive. She had moods, tempers, and a will of her own. When she groaned, they listened. When she whispered, they obeyed. And when she sailed beneath full wind, her masts creaking, her sails stretched like wings, they swore she could almost sing. By the end of a long voyage, men grew old before their time, their hair salted by wind, their hands calloused into rope. Some never stepped on land again. Others, when they finally did, found the earth itself unsteady, as if it had learned to roll like the sea. The HMS Victory would fight again, of course. But in these quiet interludes between the storms, she was more than a warship. She was a floating world, a fragile, stubborn miracle of wood and willpower. And as night fell over her decks, the watch changed, the lanterns dimmed, and the ocean whispered against her hull like a lullaby. For a brief, perfect moment, even the sea seemed to sleep. October 21st, 1805. The morning began like any other. Grey sky, light wind, the slow creak of timbers and the groan of the sea beneath the hull. But beneath that calm, every man aboard the HMS Victory knew what was coming. Word had spread through whispers and glances. The French and Spanish fleets were near. The air was different that morning, heavy, charged, like the world itself was holding its breath. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, smooth and pale under the early light. But far on the horizon, a dark line shimmered. Sails, dozens of them, the enemy, below deck. Men moved in silence. Powder monkeys filled the magazines, passing cartridges to the gunners. The surgeon laid out his instruments, knives, saws, bandages, and rum, and waited, The cooks extinguished the fires in the galley. Because fire and gunpowder make for a spectacularly bad combination, the boatswain checked the rigging. The carpenter inspected the whole, and the captain, calm and expressionless, reviewed his charts one last time. At 11:40 a.m., his single order rang out. Beat to quarters. The drums rolled, steady and grim, echoing through the decks like a heartbeat. The crew moved with mechanical precision. Cannon ports swung open. Guns were rolled into place. Powder, shot, and wadding stacked in neat piles beside each weapon. The ship's 100-foot cannons, each one a miniature volcano waiting to erupt, stood ready. Above, Admiral Horatio Nelson paced the quarterdeck. His uniform was immaculate, his expression unreadable. He had been at sea since he was 12 years old, and by now, battle was as familiar to him as breathing. Yet there was something strange about that morning, a sense of finality. He turned to his flag captain, Thomas Hardy, and said softly, "This may be the last time we shall do our duty together at sea." At 11:50, the signal flags went up, fluttering in the breeze. Nelson's final order to the fleet: "England expects that every man will do his duty," the message rippled across the British ships like a prayer. Cheers rose from every deck, and then silence again. The battle began. The Victory led the first column, sailing directly into the combined French and Spanish line, a formation bristling with over 2,600 cannons. It was madness, brilliant and reckless. And entirely in character for Nelson, the enemy opened fire first. Cannonballs screamed through the air, smashing into oak and flesh alike. Splinters as long as swords flew in every direction, tearing through men like shrapnel. Still, the Victory held her course. For 20 agonizing minutes, she endured a barrage without being able to return fire. The decks were slick with blood and splinters, the rigging torn, the sails shredded. And then, at point-blank range, Nelson gave the order. "Engage the enemy." The cannons roared. A single broadside from Victory unleashed over a ton of iron in an instant. The air vanished in the blast. Gun crews screamed, loaded, fired again. Each recoil slammed the cannon backward, smashing grooves into the deck. Smoke filled every corner of the ship, thick, choking, alive with sparks. Visibility dropped to inches. You didn't see the enemy. You felt him, in the vibration of the hull and the scream of splintering wood. Above deck, chaos. Men shouted orders no one could hear. Officers waved swords through the smoke. The noise was constant. Thunder, wood cracking. Men crying out, and through it all, the Victory kept fighting. Nelson stood calmly at the center of it, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the destruction. A splintered rail crashed beside him. He didn't flinch. He was that kind of man. The sort who could stare death in the face and critique its manners. At 1:15 p.m., as the battle reached its peak, a musket ball from a French sniper struck him in the shoulder, passed through his spine, and lodged in his chest. He fell. Captain Hardy caught him as he whispered, "They have done for me at last." He was carried below to the orlop deck, the same blood-soaked space where so many others had gone before him. The surgeon could do nothing. Nelson, pale and fading, lay listening to the sounds of his ship still fighting above. Every boom of the cannon was like a heartbeat. For hours the battle raged on. The Victory tore through the enemy line, firing broadside after broadside, until the combined fleet was shattered. Smoke drifted across the sea, thick and grey, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the creak of dying ships. By late afternoon, the outcome was clear. The Franco-Spanish fleet was broken. The Royal Navy had won. The cost was heavy, but the victory complete. Below deck, Nelson's breathing grew shallow. Hardy came to him, eyes rimmed with smoke and exhaustion. "How goes the battle?" Nelson asked. "Won," Hardy replied. "We've won." Nelson smiled faintly. "Thank God." "I have done my duty." Moments later, Horatio Nelson, Britain's greatest admiral, was gone. The guns fell silent soon after. Above, the Victory drifted among the wreckage of war. Her decks were splintered, her masts torn, but she still floated, proud and defiant. The men stood among the ruins, silent now, their ears still ringing. They had survived, most of them, and that was enough. As the sun set over Trafalgar, the sky burned gold and crimson, like the sea itself had caught fire. The smoke cleared, and for the first time in hours, the horizon was visible again. The Victory sailed slowly forward, her sails in tatters, her decks slick with blood, but her flag still flying. She had done her duty, and the world would never forget it. When the last cannon fell quiet, it was as if the world itself took a deep breath. The sea, moments before a churning chaos of gunfire and splintered ships, became eerily calm. The wind slackened, the waves gentled, and the thick black smoke began to thin into a ghostly haze. All that remained was the low groan of timbers, the drip of seawater through the decks, and the faint cries of the wounded. The HMS Victory floated in the middle of it all, her hull battered and scorched, her masts scarred, her decks littered with broken guns, torn rope, and the still bodies of men who had done their duty. The smell of salt, blood, and burnt powder hung heavy in the air, a reminder that glory always had a terrible price. Below deck, the surgeon and his mates worked in grim silence. Buckets of seawater sloshed across the floor, red and pink. Amputated limbs piled up in the corner, and the steady groans of the injured filled the gloom. The ship's boy, barely 12, passed the rum bottle from cot to cot, shaking as he went. He'd seen more of life and death in one day than most men would in a lifetime, and in the orlop deck, Admiral Nelson lay still. His face was peaceful now, his lips faintly curved as if he were simply sleeping. Round him, the ship creaked and whispered, almost respectfully. As if aware that something larger than life had passed within her timbers, the word spread through the decks slowly. "Nelson is dead." Some men wept openly. Others stared in silence. Many simply carried on, repairing ropes, clearing bodies, patching holes. The sea doesn't wait for a grief. A ship must be kept afloat. By nightfall, the British fleet held the field. The enemy was shattered, ships burning, sinking, or surrendering one by one. But even in victory, there was no celebration. The men were too tired, too numb. Instead, they sat on the gun decks, surrounded by flickering lanterns, eating cold rations in silence. Each man lost in his thoughts, wondering why he had survived when so many had not. Up above, the sky cleared. Stars began to appear, one by one, reflected faintly in the calm sea. The Victory drifted slowly among the wrecks, her sails ragged, her hull streaked with soot. The once proud battle fleet now looked like a ghost on order. At dawn, the wounded were moved, the dead sewn into canvas, and the sails rigged as best as possible. A flag covered Nelson's body, and the ship turned north, heading for home. Every creak of the timbers sounded like a sigh. The voyage back was slow. Storms rolled over the fleet, tearing at what little rigging remained. Men worked day and night, patching leaks and hulling lines with bleeding hands. Many of the wounded died along the way, and were buried at sea, lowered gently into the waves that had once roared with cannon fire. Weeks later, the Victory limped into Portsmouth harbour. Her arrival was met not with cheers, but with reverent silence. Crowds gathered along the waterfront, watching as the blackened ship came to rest. Her decks were scarred, her sails torn, her masts cracked, but her flag still flew. The same flag that had waved over Nelson's final victory. Nelson's body was brought ashore in a cask of brandy, a grim but necessary method of preservation. From there, it was taken to London, where the entire nation mourned. Streets were draped in black, bells tolled across the city, and tens of thousands followed the funeral procession. His coffin, carved from the mast of the French ship L'Orient, became a symbol of victory and sacrifice intertwined. The HMS Victory herself became something else entirely. Not just a warship, but a monument. She had seen the greatest naval battle of her age and survived it. Her decks had carried heroes, and her timbers had absorbed their stories. In the years that followed, she was repaired, refitted, and eventually retired. She served as a harbour ship, a training vessel, even a floating office. But no one could quite let her go. She had become something sacred, a relic of a time when Britain's power rested on oak and canvas, and the fate of nations was decided by wind and gunfire. By the late 19th century, she was barely afloat, her hull rotting, her paint faded, her decks sagging. Yet, somehow, she endured. Historians, sailors, and kings alike fought to preserve her, raising funds, writing letters, refusing to let her vanish into memory. And today, she still stands, permanently dry-docked in Portsmouth, her masts rising proudly against the sky. Visitors walk her decks, running their hands along the same railings Nelson touched, standing in the spot where he fell, feeling the weight of centuries pressing softly round them. The wood creaks just as it did 200 years ago. The smell of tar and salt still lingers. The cannons are silent, but the air hums with their echoes. If you listen closely, especially in the quiet hours of the evening, you can almost hear the faint roll of drums, the distant thunder of guns, the whisper of a voice saying, "England expects that every man will do his duty." And then, silence. The kind of silence only the sea can give. The HMS Victory rests now, not as a weapon, but as a witness, a ghost of oak and iron that once held the fate of empires in her sails. Her battles are long over, but her story still floats calm, eternal, and waiting for those who care to listen. Long before the guns fired, long before glory or death, a ship like the Victory was a world unto itself, a small, creaking city made of oak and iron, drifting through endless miles of grey sea. To step aboard her wasn't just to join the navy. It was to enter another universe, one where hierarchy ruled. Space was scarce, and every man, from admiral to powder monkey, played a role in keeping the great machine alive. Walking below deck was like entering the belly of some vast wooden beast. The ceilings were so low that even an average man had to stoop, and the air was a dense, sour mix of tar, sweat, and stale biscuit dust. The light came from flickering lanterns that swung with the ship's motion, painting everything in slow-moving gold and shadow. The gun deck was the ship's heartbeat. Cannons lined both sides, each with its own crew, tools, and sleeping hammocks hanging just above the barrels in battle. It became hell, but in peace it was home. Sailors cooked, mended clothes, and told stories right beside the same guns that could rip a ship apart. Sleeping quarters were as generous as you'd expect, meaning not generous at all. A sailor's hammock was slung between beams barely a foot apart, swaying gently with the rhythm of the sea. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space didn't exist. The entire lower deck was a tangle of ropes, hammocks, and bodies, all moving together in a slow, synchronized sway. Each man's possessions fit in a single sea chest, A change of clothes, a Bible or a few letters from home, maybe a pipe, and a piece of polished wood carved into a lucky charm. That was all you had to your name, and all you could keep safe. The day began at dawn with the boatswain's call, a sharp whistle echoing through the decks, followed by the clatter of feet as men sprang from their hammocks. They'd scrub the decks with sandstone and seawater until the planks shone. Then came breakfast, usually salted beef or pork, hardtack biscuits, and weak beer. Water didn't last long at sea. It turned foul within days, so beer was safer. Every man had a job. The top men climbed the rigging like acrobats, adjusting sails high above the deck even in storms. The gunners maintained their cannons with obsessive care. The carpenter patched leaks, repaired spars, and, when battle came, tried to keep the ship from sinking faster than the surgeon could save men. The surgeon himself had perhaps the worst job of all. His tools were few, his space small, and his patients many. An operation meant a wooden table, a bottle of rum, a sharp saw, and a steady hand. Anesthetics, none. If a limb had to come off, it came off fast, and the crew, hardened as they were, often sang shanties to drown out the screams. There was also the purser, the ship's accountant, responsible for rations, wages, and supplies, and notorious for pocketing a little extra whenever he could. Then came the Marine Guards, soldiers stationed aboard to keep discipline among sailors who might otherwise get ideas about mutiny, and above them all, the officers, a world apart. The captain's cabin was bright, spacious, and almost civilized. Polished brass lamps, carved furniture, even windows. His meals came on china, served with wine, while the crew ate out of wooden bowls. But even he lived under constant pressure. One storm, one mistake, and the sea would take him without ceremony. Below, in the dim lantern light, men found ways to survive monotony. They sang. They carved bits of bone or wood into small trinkets. They gambled, told ghost stories, argued about home ports they hadn't seen in years and on rare comets. They sat on the upper deck, watching the stars, the same stars sailors had followed for centuries. The smell of tar, rope, and salt never left your clothes. The sound of the creaking hull never left your ears. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Letters from home came rarely, if ever. Some men forgot what dry land even felt like. But for all the hardship, there was a strange pride among them. They belonged to something vast and powerful, the Royal Navy, the most feared force on the seas. They were the living gears of an empire that stretched across the globe. And when they saw their ship's sails fill with wind and her bow cut clean through the waves, they felt something like awe, because despite the cramped hammocks, the foul food, the endless labor, they were part of something alive, a thing of oak and iron and willpower that could defy nature itself. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind through the rigging, every beat of the drum reminded them this ship was home, dangerous, merciless, and magnificent. The HMS Victory wasn't just a warship. She was a living organism, her crew the blood, her timbers the bones, her sails the breath that carried her forward. And to live aboard her was to surrender yourself to the rhythm of the sea. To truly understand the HMS Victory, you have to think like an engineer of the 18th century, someone who built miracles out of wood, rope, and iron without a single bolt of steel or drop of electricity. Every inch of her, from the tip of her mast to the curve of her hull, was the product of human hands, sweat, and centuries of naval evolution. She wasn't just built, she was crafted. When she was launched in 1765, the Victory represented the absolute peak of British shipbuilding. Over 6,000 trees, mostly English oak, went into her construction. Each one was hand-shaped, bent, and fitted into the great puzzle of her hull. The result was a vessel over 220 feet long, weighing more than 3,500 tons, with 3 towering masts and a forest of rigging that could fill the sky. Every curve of her hull was designed to strike a balance between strength and speed. Too narrow, and she'd capsize in heavy seas. Too wide, and she'd lumber like a floating barn. The Victory's lines were perfect, sleek enough to cut through the water, sturdy enough to withstand the recoil of over 100 cannons firing broadside. Those cannons were the true heart of her power. 104 of them ranged across 3 decks, from the massive 32-pounders on the lower gun deck to the smaller 12-pounders above, together. They could unleash over a ton of iron shot in a single volley. Each gun required a crew of up to 14 men to load, aim, and fire. The process was brutally precise. After each shot, the cannon had to be sponged out, a long, damp rammer shoved into the barrel to extinguish any lingering sparks. Then came the powder cartridge, packed in a linen bag. Then the wadding, then the iron ball, and finally, the charge was rammed tight. The gun was run out again on its ropes, aimed by eye and fired. In the chaos of battle, it was like an industrial symphony, men shouting, ropes creaking, guns recoiling, smoke so thick you could barely see your own hands, but when it worked. When every gun fired in perfect rhythm, the ship itself seemed to breathe fire, above deck. The masts and sails were another kind of miracle. The Victory carried over 5,400 square yards of sail, more than an acre of canvas. It took hundreds of ropes, or lines, to control them all, and every one had a specific name and function. The sailors knew them by heart: the halyards, braces, sheets, and stays, a language of wind and wood that only the sea could teach. Climbing the rigging was a test of courage. The topmen, often barefoot, would race up the swaying ropes even in gales, 30 or 40 meters above the deck, to reef or unfurl the sails. One wrong step, and the sea would swallow them without a sound. Yet they did it daily, with a grin, because that was life at sea. Risk was as common as salt. Navigation was another matter of art and science. The ship's master and his mates used sextants to measure the angle of the sun or stars, calculating latitude with astonishing precision. Longitude, however, was the great mystery of the age, until the invention of the marine chronometer. The Victory carried one of the early models, a clock so accurate that it could tell time to within seconds even after weeks at sea. With the chronometer, the Victory could pinpoint her position almost anywhere on Earth, an invisible revolution that made the British Empire possible. Below, the carpenter's crew kept the ship alive, every plank, every seam. Every joint was checked daily for leaks. Pumps ran constantly to keep seawater from collecting in the bilge. The dock, damp space at the bottom of the ship where rats thrived and the smell could make even hardened sailors gag. The galley, or ship's kitchen, was a small brick oven bolted to the deck, and it cooked meals for over 800 men. The menu rarely changed: salted beef or pork, hardtack biscuits, and dried peas. If the ship caught fish or traded for fresh fruit in port, it was a feast. Otherwise, scurvy, the slow rot of the body caused by lack of vitamin C, was a constant threat. The Victory also had her share of strange and brilliant innovations. Her hull was coated in tar and lined with copper plates to prevent worms from boring into the wood and slowing her down. Her anchors, massive and black, were hauled by capstans turned by entire teams of men walking in circles, singing rhythmic work songs to keep time. And then there was her steering, the great wheel on the quarterdeck, connected by ropes and pulleys to the tiller far below. In heavy weather, It took for men to turn it. One misstep, one snapped rope, and the ship could lose control completely. But despite all the danger, all the chaos, the Victory was an incredibly efficient system. Every man knew his role. Every sound had meaning. Every creak told a story. Together, they formed one of the most complex machines ever made before the industrial age, powered entirely by human will and the wind. When she sailed at full spread, her sails white against the grey sky, she moved with a kind of slow majesty that modern ships could never match. There was no engine, no smoke, no steel. Just the whisper of canvas, the deep groan of oak, and the endless breathing sea, and perhaps that's what made her more than a weapon. She was alive. Every voyage, every storm, every battle carved a little more soul into her timbers, and centuries later, standing aboard her in Portsmouth, you can still feel that. The heartbeat of a ship that once ruled the waves. If the HMS Victory was a masterpiece of wood and iron, then discipline was the glue that held it together. Though, to be fair, it was more like tar, thick, dark, and applied with a whip. Life on board wasn't about freedom or adventure. It was about obedience. The Royal Navy ran on a simple principle, that 850 men could only coexist peacefully inside a wooden box if most of them were slightly afraid at all times. The rules were everywhere. You could be punished for drunkenness, fighting, theft, insolence, sleeping on watch, or even looking at an officer funny. Technically, you could also be punished for whistling, because sailors believed it could whistle up a storm, and since superstition outranked reason at sea, better to be flogged than cursed. The instrument of authority was the catto, 9 tails, a whip made of 9 knotted cords that could flay skin like paper. It was used publicly, often on the main deck, so that everyone could watch and remember that pain was policy. A sailor sentenced to 12 lashes would be tied to the grating, shirt off, while the boatswain's mate, the ship's unofficial sadist, delivered the blows in front of the assembled crew. The first few cuts were sharp, the last few were personal. Afterward, rum was issued, not to the punished man, but to the spectators, a cheerful reminder that discipline was entertainment. 2 severe crimes, desertion, mutiny, or striking an officer, could mean hanging, or worse, being keel-hauled. That meant being tied to a rope, dragged under the hull from one side of the ship to the other, across barnacles sharp as razors. If you survived, congratulations, you were still in the Navy. And yet, as brutal as it sounds, this system worked. Fear was efficient. The Navy had little room for democracy. There was one captain, one chain of command, and no room for debate in a storm. The punishment system was the dark engine that kept the Victory functioning. But there was another side to shipboard life, one the Admiralty didn't write down: the rituals, the jokes, the strange superstitions that filled the space between fear and boredom. For instance, sailors believed whistling could summon the wind, but only if done by the right person. A woman on board was bad luck, but a naked woman carved on the ship's bow, the figurehead, was good luck because she calmed the sea. Hence the dozens of topless wooden angels decorating naval ships. Maritime logic at its finest. Black cats were considered lucky, as were tattoos, though tattoos were usually done with soot, rum, and whatever rusty needle was available. Many sailors tattooed anchors, swallows, or the word "hold fast" across their knuckles, a personal prayer to the gods of the deep. The sea was their god. Really, it could feed you, drown you, or ignore you completely, and in the middle of that vast indifference, men created their own small universes, jokes, songs, rituals. They named the rats, played cards by lantern light, carved trinkets from whalebone, and swore loyalty to each other more fiercely than to the crown. And then there was rum, the true equalizer. Every sailor was entitled to a half-pint of it daily, mixed with water to make grog. Officially, it prevented scurvy. Unofficially, it prevented rebellion. Drunkenness was a sin, but a tolerated one. After all, a tipsy sailor was a happy sailor, and a happy sailor was slightly less likely to throw his officer overboard. There were also shipboard traditions of mockery. The crossing the line ceremony, for example, when the Victory crossed the equator. Neptune himself, usually a sailor in a fake beard and mop wig, would appear to initiate the new crew. This involved shaving cream, cold water, and general humiliation, all in good fun, unless you were the one getting dumped headfirst into a barrel. To survive at sea was to adapt, laugh, and occasionally scream into the wind. Discipline might keep the ship afloat, but humor kept the men alive. Still, the strain of it all was immense. Imagine living for months, sometimes years, inside the same creaking wooden world. The sound of ropes and waves became background music. The smell of tar and sweat, inescapable. The same faces, the same food, the same tasks. Time itself lost meaning. That's where the sailor's mind learned to drift, half in reality, half in memory. They dreamed of home, of land, of soft beds and silent nights. But they also feared those dreams, because the sea was jealous. The moment you started thinking about home, it seemed the wind turned foul. And so they clung to the routine, the rhythm of the bells marking each watch, the songs they sang as they hauled ropes, sea shanties that turned labor into melody, the laughter after punishment, the grog at sunset, the steady, endless motion of the horizon. The Victory wasn't just a warship. She was a floating society, cruel, loyal, superstitious, efficient, and somehow, against all odds, alive. Because when 850 souls share the same heartbeat for months on end, something strange happens. The ship becomes a living thing, and every man aboard a part of it. The sound of her timbers, the groan of her hull, the whisper of the sea, all of it fuses into one rhythm, the rhythm of survival, and that, more than any cannon or captain, was what made the Victory unbeatable. By October 1805, HMS Victory had seen more of the world than most empires ever would. She had weathered storms, mutinies, and decades of service. But the dawn of October 21st, 1805, off the southwest coast of Spain, would be her defining moment. The Battle of Trafalgar was more than just a naval clash. It was the turning point of the Napoleonic Wars. A storm of cannon fire that would decide whether Britain ruled the waves or sank beneath them. And at the center of it all stood Victory, and her captain, Admiral Horatio Nelson. Nelson was, to put it mildly, not your average officer. He was small, one-eyed, missing arm, and powered entirely by patriotic caffeine and sheer audacity. His men adored him. His enemies respected him. He was the kind of man who could inspire a crew to charge into cannon fire while smiling about it. On that morning, Nelson's fleet of 27 ships faced 33 French and Spanish vessels under Admiral Villeneuve. The odds weren't great, but Nelson had no interest in odds. Instead of lining up in the traditional broadside formation, like polite gentlemen, Nelson decided to cut across the enemy line at a right angle, splitting them into and forcing a chaotic melee. It was bold. It was reckless. It was, frankly, genius. Aboard Victory, the crew prepared for battle like a grim ballet. The decks were sanded down to absorb blood. Loose gear was stowed away. Gun crews stripped to the waist, tied scarves round their heads. and waited beside their 32-pounder cannons. Each man had one job: to load, aim, fire, and survive. At 11:50 a.m., Nelson raised his now mortal signal. England expects that every man will do his duty. Cheers erupted. Then silence. Then thunder. Victory led the charge directly into enemy fire. Cannonballs tore through her sails, splintered her hull, and ripped through men like paper. But she didn't stop. The wind carried her forward, straight into the line of French ships. At 12:45, she collided with the French flagship Bucentaur. The two giants locked together like beasts. Victory's gunners unleashed a devastating broadside. Double-shotted cannons firing into point-blank range. The recoil shook the entire ship. The air turned white with smoke and screams. The battle became chaos. Musket fire rained from the rigging. Sharpshooters picked off officers, and the decks ran slick with seawater and blood. The noise was unimaginable. A rolling storm of thunder, wood, and agony. Some sailors went deaf permanently. Others fought blind in the haze. But still they loaded and fired, again and again, until their shoulders bled from recoil burns and the guns themselves overheated. And through it all, Nelson stood calmly on deck, in full uniform, glittering in medals, a perfect target. He refused to take cover. "The men must see me today," he said. At 1:15 p.m., a French marksman from the Redoutable spotted him. A single musket ball flew across the smoky air, entered Nelson's shoulder, tore through his spine, and lodged in his chest. He collapsed. His officers caught him and carried him below deck. But the battle raged on. Victory's guns kept roaring, one by one. Enemy ships surrendered or exploded. Nelson, lying on a mattress in the orlop deck, the dock, crowded infirmly below the waterline, asked only one question: how goes the battle? When told that Victory had captured 15 enemy ships, he whispered, "Thank God. I have done my duty." And then, just after 4:30 p.m., the heart of the British Navy stopped beating. Nelson was dead. The battle was won. The scene that followed was equal parts triumph and heartbreak. As the Victory limped back to England, her decks were shattered, her rigging torn, her timbers soaked with salt, blood, and glory. Nelson's body was preserved in a cask of brandy to prevent decay, a grim, but practical sailor-esque solution. When the ship finally reached home, the nation erupted in mourning. Nelson became a myth overnight, a blend of courage, sacrifice, and British stubbornness immortalized in Oak and Ocean and HMS Victory. The ship that had carried him to both triumph and death became a floating shrine. She had survived more than 40 battles, outlasted countless storms, and now carried the memory of the greatest admiral in history. Even today, the Victory still sits in Portsmouth, preserved in dry dock, her yellow hull bright against the English sky. She is the oldest commissioned warship in the world, still technically part of the Royal Navy. If you walk her decks now, you can still hear the creak of her timbers. The same boards where Nelson stood, where the gunners worked, where the sea's heartbeat once echoed. She no longer sails, but she breathes through the memories of every sailor who ever lived, fought, and died aboard her. The Victory isn't just a museum. She is a survivor, a witness to an age when men fought for empire on the open sea, when ships were made of wood, hearts of iron, and courage of something even harder to name. And as the lanterns flicker in her old cabin, it's easy to imagine the whispers of those who once called her home, the laughter, the fear, the rum, the thunder. The sea may forget names, but not the Victory. The guns of Trafalgar eventually went quiet. The smoke lifted, the ships drifted apart, and the sea, that ancient, indifferent wetness, smoothed itself back into calm. As though it hadn't just swallowed hundreds of men, for HMS Victory. There would be no grand retirement party, no medals, no rest. The war might have ended for a moment, but duty never truly stopped. After Trafalgar, she limped home, timbers cracked, sails in tatters, rigging dangling like broken nerves. Her decks were scarred from cannon fire, her sides pocked with holes, and yet she floated. Still proud, still alive. She had lost her admiral, but not her purpose. When Victory reached England, crowds lined the harbours to see her. She was more than just a ship now. She was legend, a floating monument to British endurance, and yet, beneath the cheers, her crew were shadows of themselves. Many were wounded, deafened, or simply exhausted beyond measure. The sea had taken its toll. Some left the Navy altogether, returning home to families that barely recognized them. Others stayed aboard, because the ocean, brutal as it was the only home they'd ever known. In the years that followed, HMS Victory continued to serve, though never again as she once had. The age of sail was fading, slowly, quietly, replaced by engines, steel, and smoke. The romantic crack of canvas and timber was giving way to the hum of machines. By the early 19th century, the Victory had become too old for frontline duty. Her timbers creaked more than they should, her hull leaked in places once sealed tight. She was moved from battle to harbour service, then to training, then, eventually, to a stationary flagship in Portsmouth. There, she would remain, watching the world change, watching empires rise and fall. It's hard to imagine what that must have felt like, if ships could feel. To have once thundered across oceans, to have carried an admiral into immortality, and then to sit still, year after year, listening to the wind hum through the rigging that no longer moves. But there's a kind of peace in that, too. The peace of survival. In the 1830s, she was almost lost again, not to battle, but to neglect. Her hull was rotting, her masts collapsing, and for a time, the Admiralty debated scrapping her entirely. After all, she was old, obsolete, expensive to maintain. But the public wouldn't have it. The people of Britain had not forgotten. The Victory was Nelson's ship, and Nelson's ship could not be burned for lumber. So she was spared, restored, repaired, preserved, and by the late 19th century, she had become what she remains today, a living relic. Visitors came to walk her decks, tracing the same planks that sailors had bled and preyed on. Children ran their hands along the gun ports. Veterans saluted her silently. And the sea, just beyond the harbour walls, whispered the same old lullaby it always has. You can still hear it, even now. The creak of timber, the faint slap of water against the hull. If you close your eyes, you can imagine the voices, faint, echoing, far away, the midshipmen calling out orders, the powder boy's hurried footsteps. The deep, booming laugh of a sailor on night watch, the murmur of hymns during burial at sea. Time has taken them all, but memory lingers. Today, HMS Victory sits preserved in dry dock at Portsmouth, her hull painted in that unmistakable black and yellow Nelson checker, her guns silent but ready. Her decks open to anyone who wants to walk through history itself. She's not just a museum piece. She's a heartbeat, steady, enduring, centuries old. Every nail, every rope, every worn step in the planking is a story. When the evening light falls across her stern, the air seems to shimmer. The scent of salt, oak, and iron feels like time itself has paused. And as the world modernizes round her, nuclear submarines gliding silently nearby, the Victory remains exactly what she has always been, a survivor. And maybe that's what makes her truly eternal. Not just the battles or the glory, but the endurance, the ability to stay, to bear witness, to simply keep existing, because in the end, that's the greatest victory of all, to endure, to remember, to float on. Even when the sea itself has forgotten the rest. Night falls slowly over Portsmouth Harbour. The modern city glows in the distance, but inside the dry dock the world feels older, quieter. Lantern light glints off polished brass. The smell of oak and tar still hangs in the air. And there, beneath a canopy of rigging that hasn't felt wind into centuries, HMS Victory keeps her last watch. No orders echo now. No boots on planks. Only the soft creak of timbers as the old ship settles against her blocks. She has done her duty. She has outlived her makers. She has outlived the wars that gave her purpose. If you stand on her quarterdeck at closing time, when the last visitors have gone and the museum lights dim, you can hear it the hush that follows history, a faint vibration through the wood, like a heartbeat slow almost to stillness. The sea, just beyond the wall, breathes in and out. And for a moment, the centuries collapse. You can imagine the men returning to their hammocks, the whisper of canvas folding, the slow clank of a lantern swinging, a final murmur of laughter from the gun deck before sleep. Then silence thick, complete and endless. It's strange how a ship becomes more than wood and rope. She becomes memory. Every plank holds the echo of a voice. Every scar tells a story that words can't quite reach. In her grain is courage and grief, and the strange, steady rhythm of those who went to sea because someone had to. She has seen the ocean in every mood, the glitter of calm mornings, the green fury of storms, the red haze of battle, and the quiet grey of aftermath. Now, she sees only reflection, the slow shimmer of moonlight over still water. People call her a relic, but she's something rarer, a reminder of an age when the world was larger, when the horizon meant mystery, and when human hands could build something that would outlast them all. If you listen long enough, you might hear a whisper through the rigging. Not words, exactly, but a feeling. A mixture of pride and longing, like the sea itself remembering. And maybe that's what HMS Victory truly represents. Not war, or empire, or even triumph, but endurance. The quiet strength to weather every storm and still float, even when the wind is gone. So, let the harbour fall asleep round her. Let the city lights fade to stars. Let the tide whisper against the dock one more time. Because somewhere out there, beyond the noise of the modern world, the ocean still calls to her softly, patiently, like an old friend. And though she will never sail again, she answers in her own way. Not with motion, but with memory. Not with battle, but with peace. A ship at rest. A story completed. A victory that never ends. If you ever step aboard HMS Victory, the first thing you'll notice is just how close everything feels. The decks are low, the air heavy, and the corridors narrow enough to make even an average-sized person duck. It's not the grand, open space people imagine when they picture a ship of legend. No, below the proud gun decks and fluttering flags was a world of shadows, sweat, and survival. Let's go below deck. The sunlight fades almost immediately. The air turns thick, a mixture of salt, smoke, and humanity. You hear the creak of ropes, the low murmur of sailors off duty, the occasional clang of a hammer as someone repairs a beam. It's dim, lit only by oil lamps swinging gently with the motion of the ship. Down here, Hundreds of men lived shoulder to shoulder. They ate, slept, worked, and sometimes died in the same cramped space. The smell alone was legendary. A blend of tar, wet rope, gunpowder, rum, and the unmistakable tang of unwashed sailors who'd been at sea for months. The lower gun deck wasn't just where the cannons lived. It was home. Between each massive 32-pounder gun sat a small mess, a group of 6 to 8 men who shared everything: food, space, chores, and whatever sanity they could hold on to. They'd eat sitting on the deck, their plates balanced on the cannon itself. Dinner might be salted beef hard as wood, or a lump of biscuit so full of weevils it practically twitched on its own. They didn't mind much, as long as it filled the stomach. It did the job. When night fell, hammocks were strung between the guns, hundreds of them swaying gently in rhythm with the sea. Picture it: the sound of ropes creaking, men snoring, the occasional curse as someone's hammock rope snapped and they landed face first on the deck. Privacy didn't exist. You were never alone, not even for a moment. And yet, somehow, they adapted. The rhythm of the ship became the rhythm of their lives. Wake at dawn, swap the decks, drill the guns, eat, sleep, repeat. Every man aboard Victory had a specific role, and discipline was everything. The Royal Navy didn't run on democracy. It ran on hierarchy, strict and absolute. The captain's word was law. Disobedience wasn't met with a scolding. It was met with the cato, 9 tails, a whip of knotted cords that tore flesh with every strike. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, at least, not always. A warship depended on order. One man's mistake could sink the ship. The lash kept fear sharpened. Loyalty sharper, still. Life wasn't all misery. There were moments of humanity. Laughter over a game of dice, a sailor carving his initials into the wood, the rare treat of fresh bread after a supply stop, and rum, always rum. The daily ration, half a pint per man, was sacred, mixed with water and lime juice to make grog. It was both medicine and morale booster. The purser, the man responsible for food and drink, often faced a crew that both depended on him and despised him. Short rations could spark mutiny, but when the grog flowed, so did the spirits. Then there was music. Sailors brought fiddles, whistles, even bagpipes aboard. When the day's labor ended, a few tunes might echo through the lower decks, shanties about home, women, and ports that existed more in memory than reality. The songs were crude, funny, sad, human. In the quiet hours, you could hear the heartbeat of the ship itself, the rhythmic creak of beams, the whisper of the sea against the hull, the soft groan of timber expanding and shrinking with the cold. It was a kind of lullaby, rough but strangely comforting, and somewhere above, the officers dined by candlelight, their tablecloths clean, their plates porcelain, their meals slightly less miserable. The contrast between decks was stark, a floating example of class on the high seas. Yet in battle, that distance vanished. Officer or sailor, everyone fought the same fire, breathed the same smoke, faced the same cannonball. The ship didn't care for rank when the guns began to roar. Down below, in the heart of the Victory, everything came alive when the order to prepare for action echoed down the companionway. The calm hum of routine transformed into thunderous motion. Gun crews rushed to their stations. Powder boys, some barely 12 years old, darted between the guns with bags of black powder tied to their chests. Their small size made them perfect runners. Though one spark could turn them into ghosts in an instant, the decks shook with each blast. Smoke thickened the air until no one could see more than a few feet ahead. And through it all, The men shouted, sweated, and reloaded, faster and faster, like parts of a single living machine. It's easy to forget, listening now in comfort, how close these men lived to death, and how casually they accepted it. They were not heroes in their own eyes. They were sailors, doing their job, bound to a wooden world that demanded everything and offered little. And yet, there's something quietly noble in that. The same endurance that carried victory through Trafalgar was born right here, in the heat, the noise, and the shadows of her lower decks, where life was harsh, but real, where the heart of the ship beat loudest. If the lower decks were the muscle of the Victory, then the quarterdeck was its mind, and its ego. Up here, the air smelled slightly less of sweat and slightly more of ambition. The officer's world was a different universe altogether. Polished wood, brass fittings that gleamed in the sunlight, and the faint aroma of pipe smoke and tea drifting from the captain's cabin. The ceilings were still low, but the mood was taller, a blend of authority, calculation, and polite rivalry. Let's begin with the captain's cabin, the grandest room on the ship. It stretched across the stern, where the great windows looked out onto the sea, a luxury view, though not one often enjoyed. In battle, those windows were boarded up. In peace, they framed sunsets and storms in equal measure. The captain's life was both privileged and crushingly heavy. Every decision, every punishment, every victory or loss, his name carried it all. He ate from porcelain, drank from crystal, and slept in a proper bed instead of a hammock. But he also bore the weight of hundreds of lives. One wrong call, and the Victory might vanish beneath the waves. Aboard Victory, that man was Captain Thomas Hardy, Nelson's right hand, calm when Nelson was flamboyant, steady when Nelson was daring. Hardy was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. The crew trusted him, even loved him in the quiet, suspicious way sailors loved anyone with power. Then there were the lieutenants, the next rung down, young, ambitious men trained to command, but not yet trusted to. They rotated watches, kept order, and did the endless arithmetic of running a floating city. How much food remained? How many barrels of water had gone bad? Whether the ship's heading matched the admiral's signal? They lived in small cabins barely large enough for a bunk and a chest. Privacy was rare, but pride plentiful. To be a lieutenant was to balance on the knife edge between authority and anonymity. They were the officers who actually made the ship work, but also the first to take the blame when it didn't tee. Below them came the midshipmen, or middies, the apprentices of empire. Some were barely 14, sons of nobility sent to earn their sea legs. They learned everything: gunnery, navigation, seamanship, and the delicate art of not crying when yelled at by a bosun. A midshipman's cabin was essentially a cupboard. His uniform was crisp, his manners drilled, and his dreams of promotion endless. Most would never make it to command, the few would die trying. But all shared the same fire, the hunger to rise through salt, sweat, and sheer audacity. Meanwhile, the master, one of the most vital men aboard, handled navigation. He wasn't an aristocrat like most officers. He was a professional, a man of skill and mathematics. He read the stars, charted the winds, and ensured the ship arrived where it was supposed to, which, in the age before GPS, was a minor miracle every time. The master's world was made of sextants, compasses, and calculations scribbled by candlelight while the ship pitched beneath him, one wrong sum. And Victory could find herself decorating a reef somewhere off Portugal. And finally, there were the surgeons, the men of science aboard this floating fortress. Their quarters smelled of rum, blood, and despair, part infirmary, part operating theatre, part nightmare. Amputation was their most common cure, done with sores rinsed in seawater and steadied hands that had long since learned not to shake. They were respected, but only quietly. Too much of their work reminded the men of mortality, something best ignored when you live surrounded by cannonballs. Above them all, however, was one man whose presence turned Victory from a ship into legend, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. When Nelson stepped on deck, everything seemed to sharpen. The air, the light, even the crew's posture. He wasn't tall, but he didn't need to be. Charisma has no height. His uniform blazed with gold braid and medals, more theatre than attire. One eye gone, one arm missing, but his willpower unbroken. He was the sort of man who inspired loyalty even when his plans looked like madness, and they often did. Nelson believed in aggression, in daring maneuvers, in breaking the rigid chessboard rules of naval warfare. Never mind the maneuvers, he once said. Go straight at them. It sounded reckless. It was. But it also worked on the Victory. Command was a performance as much as a responsibility. Nelson knew the power of spectacle, the way a flash of courage or a well-timed speech could stiffen hundreds of weary backs. His men followed him not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Yet, even in this world of polished boots and polished manners, life wasn't comfortable. Officers were always aware that a single bad wind, a single splinter of oak, could send them to the same cold grave as any sailor. In the quiet nights between battles, when the sea hummed softly beneath the hull, even Nelson himself would pace the deck, staring into the dark horizon. He had built his fame on victory, but fame is a heavy anchor. The higher he rose, the lonelier he became, and Victory, the ship herself, bore witness to it all. Her timbers had soaked in the laughter, arguments, and whispered fears of men who commanded empires from a patch of oak adrift in the Atlantic. From the sweat-stained hammocks below to the candle-lit maps above, every creak of her planks was a conversation between classes, between the world of labor and the world of leadership. Together, they formed one machine, messy, magnificent, and just barely under control, and soon that machine would face the greatest test in naval history. The Battle of Trafalgar was waiting, and with it, immortality. October 20th, 1805. The sea off the coast of Spain was glassy and still, a silence so thick it felt unnatural. The Victory sat among the fleet like a beast at rest, her guns silent, her crew whispering instead of shouting. Everyone knew what tomorrow would bring. For weeks, the British had hunted the combined French and Spanish fleets, and now, at last, they were cornered off Cape Trafalgar. 40 ships of the line, more than 2,500 cannons, and nearly 40,000 men waited for dawn. That night, the ocean didn't roar. It breathed slowly, patiently, the calm before history, below deck. The crew made final preparations. Powder monkeys, some no older than 12, carried cartridges. From the magazine to the gun decks, their faces pale in the lantern light. The gunners checked their tackles and sponges. The carpenters patched the hole where they could. The cooks salted the last of the beef and whispered prayers over it. The air smelled of tar, sweat, and fear in the great cabin. Nelson gathered his captains for what would become one of the most famous briefings in naval history. They called it the Trafalgar Conference. He didn't read from charts or bark orders. He just spoke calmly, directly, with the kind of clarity that can only come from someone who knows the odds. He told them his plan, not to fight line to line as tradition demanded, but to break the enemy formation in two, a daring, reckless maneuver no admiral had ever attempted on such a scale. He trusted his captains completely. No captain can do very wrong. He said, if he places his ship alongside that of an enemy. That was Nelson's genius, simplicity. No complex codes, no endless flags. Just courage. When the meeting ended, the captains returned to their ships in the dark. Lanterns bobbed across the water like ghostly stars. A few exchanged quiet farewells, though none dared call them that aloud. Back aboard the Victory, Nelson wrote letters to the Admiralty, to his brother, and one final message to his beloved Lady Emma Hamilton. My dearest beloved Emma, he wrote, my last thoughts will be of you and my country. Outside his cabin, the ship hummed with nervous energy. Some men sang softly. Old sea shanties turned into lullabies for courage. Others cleaned their muskets or sharpened cutlasses they prayed not to use. Down in the lower gun deck, one sailor carved his initials into the timber beside his hammock. Another lay awake, staring at the swinging lantern, counting heartbeats. They had been to war before, but everyone felt it. This would be different. This battle would decide not just lives, but the fate of empires. Above them, the sea remained eerily calm. The moon floated high and thin, painting the sails silver. Every rope, every line of rigging creaked like an old cathedral waiting for its congregation. Nelson, restless, walked the deck long past midnight. The officers pretended not to notice his limp. All the way his single eye lingered on the horizon, as though he could already see the battle to come. At one point, he paused and spoke softly to Hardy. Tomorrow, Hardy, I shall gain either a peerage or Westminster Abbey. Hardy smiled faintly, knowing that both might be true. As the first light of dawn crept over the water, the lookout's voice broke the silence. Enemy fleet in sight. Every man aboard Victory froze. The stillness of the night shattered in an instant. Bells rang. Orders echoed. Drums rolled. The long calm had ended. The French and Spanish fleet stretched across the horizon, a forest of masts and sails glittering in the sunrise. Nelson raised his telescope, scanning the enemy line. Then, quietly, he gave the order that would begin one of the most famous battles ever fought on water. England expects that every man will do his duty. The signal flags climbed into the sky. A ripple of cheers ran down the decks, followed by the unmistakable sound of courage taking shape, the clatter of cannonballs, the rumble of rolling powder carts, the creak of the ship turning into the wind. Men took their posts, gunners at the ready, Marines at the rigging, powder boys waiting in silence. The Victory leaned into the wind and began to move forward, straight toward the enemy line. For the sailors of the Victory, it felt like eternity. The ships closed at a crawl, each minute stretching longer than the last. The enemy cannons flashed at long range, their iron shot whizzing overhead. Nelson stood on deck, serene, his hat cocked, his medals gleaming in the morning sun. Behind him, Hardy murmured, "It will soon begin." Nelson only nodded. Let it. And as the Victory drifted into the jaws of the Franco-Spanish line, the first cannon roared, and the sea itself seemed to explode. The morning sun glinted off the enemy's sails, but it did little to soften the terror awaiting the men of the Victory. As the British fleet closed, French and Spanish cannons erupted, a thunderous roar that made the sea shudder. Smoke curled upward in thick, choking clouds. Splinters flew like deadly rain, slicing into sails, masts, and flesh alike. Nelson's plan was madness on a grand scale. 2 columns of British ships would drive straight at the enemy, cutting their line and striking at the heart of the fleet. It was audacious, it was suicidal, and somehow it worked. The Victory led the charge. Cannon fire tore through her rigging. splintering wood and sending men tumbling across the deck. Screams mingled with the roar of guns. The smell of gunpowder burned eyes and lungs. Every swing of a cutlass, every tumble of a musket, was part of a terrifying choreography orchestrated by death itself. Above the carnage, Nelson remained a calm island. His one good eye scanned the battlefield, noting the positioning of enemy ships and sending signals to his captains. He wore every medal, sash, and braid he could, standing out like a beacon. Subtlety had never been his game. As the Victory crashed into the French line, she became a battering ram of oak and fire. Broadside after broadside tore into the enemy flagship. Cannonballs smashed through decks, spitting men into the sea. Splinters like shards of glass shredded limbs. The noise was biblical, the chaos worse. And then fate struck. A French sharpshooter, perched high in the rigging of an enemy ship, took aim. One shot. One fatal shot. It struck Nelson in the shoulder, passed through his spine, and toppled the hero to the deck. Yet even mortally wounded, Nelson refused the morphine brought by the ship's surgeon. British heroism, apparently, required maximum suffering. He lay on the deck, listening as the battle raged round him, issuing commands through gritted teeth. "Do your duty," he whispered. "England expects every man for ours." The battle raged on. The Victory moved like a beast possessed. Her broadsides cutting down enemy after enemy. 22 ships were captured or sunk by the end. Of the day, not a single British vessel was lost. The sea became a graveyard of splintered wood, torn sails and bodies. 3 hours after being shot, Nelson breathed his last. "Thank God I have done my duty." He murmured. England had been saved, Napoleon's invasion thwarted, and a legend immortalized, in death as much as life. Below deck, sailors tended the wounded. Surgeons worked frantically, amputating limbs with little more than adrenaline and rum for courage. The dead were sewn into hammocks, weighted with cannonballs, and slid into the sea. Sometimes stitched through the nose, just to be sure, by nightfall. The Victory floated among the wreckage, battered but undefeated. Her masts hung in tatters, rigging dangled, and cannon ports were shattered. Blood, sea water, and rum coated the decks, and yet she remained upright, triumphant amid chaos. Nelson's body was preserved in a cask of brandy, a sticky, alcohol-soaked time capsule of British heroism. Sailors toasted him with the same rum, honoring the man who had led them through hell and survived in memory. If not in flesh, the Victory had earned her name that day. A ship of triumph wrapped in tragedy, she had defeated 2 fleets at once. But the cost was visible in every shattered deck, in every scarred sailor, in every splintered timber. The world would remember Trafalgar as a glorious victory. Those aboard the Victory would remember it as hell with a view. The guns finally fell silent. The smoke cleared, revealing a sea littered with wreckage, splinters, and the floating remnants of ships once proud and strong. The Victory herself had taken a beating. Her sails were shredded, her masts cracked, and her decks slick with blood and seawater. But against all odds, she floated. A testament to human craftsmanship and sheer stubbornness. The survivors worked tirelessly. Wounded men groaned below deck as surgeons moved like shadows in the dim light, performing amputations and patching shrapnel wounds. Dead sailors were sewn into hammocks, weighted, and returned to the sea. Every action, from tending the injured to repairing the rigging, was a grim exercise in survival. Nelson's body lay in a cask of brandy, preserved for the journey home. It was a macabre but practical solution, a sticky form of early cryogenics. Sailors toasted their fallen admiral with the same alcohol that kept him preserved. A ritual of efficiency and respect. Repairs on the Victory began immediately. Decks were cleared of debris. Rigging was replaced, and splintered timbers were hammered back into place. The work was exhausting, brutal and relentless, but the ship endured. She had become more than a vessel. She was a symbol of British naval power, a floating monument to courage, skill, and sheer stubbornness. When she finally returned to Portsmouth, the Victory was battered but victorious. Her fighting days were over, yet her service was far from finished. Stripped of her sails and her glory, she became a harbour ship, a floating barracks, and a storage depot. Imagine being one of history's most celebrated warships. Reduced to delivering spare rope and housing board sailors, time was unkind. By the mid-19th century, her hull sagged, masts cracked, and timbers groaned like an old man rising from bed. The Admiralty considered scrapping her, but the public outcry made it clear you could not discard a ship that had saved a nation. So she was preserved, in a deliberately minimalist way, allowed to age gracefully while still afloat. A relic for curious tourists. In the 20th century, preservation became more scientific. In 1922, the Victory was moved to a dry dock and declared a national treasure. Restoration began in earnest. Carpenters muttering at the absurdity of repairing a 150-year-old warship that somehow still floated. During World War II, she survived bombings, proving that even after centuries, the Victory was not ready to give up. Today, she remains in Portsmouth Dockyard, the oldest commissioned warship still afloat, part museum, part miracle, and part architectural puzzle. Visitors can walk her decks, admire her guns, and imagine the roar of cannon fire that once shook her timbers. She no longer sails, but her presence is commanding. The Victory endures as a reminder that humans armed with nothing but wood, wind, and tenacity build machines capable of shaping history. The legacy of Trafalgar is inseparable from the men who served aboard her. The sailors, carpenters, and surgeons endured horrors that are difficult to imagine today. They worked through blood, exhaustion, and splinters, ensuring that Britain's triumph was not just a victory of strategy, but a triumph of human will. And so the Victory lives on, a time capsule of endurance, a symbol of ambition, and a testament to the price of glory. Every plank, every cannon, every scarred deck whispers the story of a day when a nation held its breath and witnessed history being forged in smoke, fire, and splintered oak. Long after the cannons of Trafalgar fell silent, a different kind of conquest unfolded. Thousands of years earlier, in 327 BCE, deep in the unforgiving mountains of Sawdust, Alexander's army, exhausted and bloodied, finally brought the rebel stronghold known as the Sogdian Rock to its knees. The fortress, considered impregnable, perched atop sheer cliffs where even birds hesitated to land. Yet Alexander, ever the showman of conquest, scaled it with a handful of daring climbers. By dawn, the Macedonian banner fluttered at the summit. Among the captured nobles was Oxyates, a Bactrian satrap, and his daughter, Roxana. Ancient sources describe her not just as beautiful, but as luminous, with features that carried both Eastern grace and fierce dignity. Her name meant Little Star, and to Alexander, she became more than a trophy. She was a symbol, the embodiment of the world he sought to unite, unlike the Macedonian generals, who expected to claim her as spoils of war. Alexander treated Roxana with honor. That night, amid flickering torchlight, she appeared veiled, calm and courageous. At perhaps 16, she carried herself with a poise that silenced the room, and for the first time in years, Alexander's ambition turned inward. Here was someone who could match him, challenge him, and perhaps soften him. Their union was unprecedented. Alexander's marriage to Roxana was both love and strategy. It symbolized the merging of East and West, Greek steel with Persian silk. By embracing Persian customs and honoring his pride, he conveyed legitimacy to the East while shocking his Macedonian generals. His simple act, sharing a loaf of bread, became a sacred gesture of union, a quiet declaration that conquest could be tempered by respect and alliance. Roxana's role was perilous. Macedonian nobles whispered behind her back, calling her the barbarian bride, while Persian courtiers watched warily, yet she endured. Learning court politics with intelligence and caution, she accompanied Alexander on campaigns, sharing his tents, meals, and rare moments of quiet reflection. Her presence symbolized loyalty, unity, and the fragile peace between ambition and affection. Together, they faced the brutal march through the Hindu Kush and India. Soldiers suffered under sun and monsoon, elephants slipped, and supplies dwindled, yet Roxana remained visible. A constant reminder that the conqueror was also a husband. She witnessed Alexander's compassion, his rare gestures of mercy, and the heavy price of empire building. By 323 BCE, in Babylon, Alexander's health and resolve began to falter. Fever, exhaustion, and perhaps fate closed in. Roxana, now pregnant, stayed at his side as he planned further conquests. When his closest companion, Hephaestion, died suddenly, Alexander's grief turned to mania, and the line between god and man-blood. He spoke openly of his divinity, demanding ritual and adoration. Through it all, Roxana endured, offering comfort while navigating the dangerous currents of court intrigue. When Alexander finally succumbed to illness, Roxana's world changed forever. She was left to navigate the politics of a fractured empire, a queen whose power was both symbolic and precarious. Yet her marriage had already altered history. In uniting Macedon and Bactria, East and West, she became more than a wife. She became a living testament to diplomacy, loyalty, and the enduring power of human connection amidst the chaos of conquest. Alexander and Roxana's story reminds us that behind every great conqueror is someone who shapes his legacy quietly, subtly, yet indelibly. While empires rise and fall, battles are won and lost, it is these human threads, courage, loyalty, love, and vision, that endure through history, echoing as loudly as cannon fires, softly as whispered affection beneath the desert stars. On the 11th day, the conqueror of the known world drew his final, labored breath in the grand palace of Babylon. The air, thick with incense and fever, seemed to pause outside the palace walls. Soldiers wept openly, tearing at their tunics, their faces streaked with grief and disbelief. Inside, Roxana sat silently beside his body, her face veiled, her future uncertain, her heart heavy with the weight of worlds she had yet to navigate. The woman who had united East and West through love now faced an entirely different kind of battle, one not fought with swords, phalanxes, or cavalry charges, but with survival, cunning, and the unrelenting tide of political ambition. Alexander's body lay cold on the ornate bed, the conqueror who had spanned continents now utterly silent. His empire, so vast it stretched from the Nile to the Indus, suddenly had no heartbeat. Chaos rippled through cities, forts, and garrisons alike. Generals who had once marched in unison beneath his banners turned on one, another like wolves over a fallen stag. And at the very center of this storm stood Roxana, now a widow and soon to be a mother. She understood immediately the grim arithmetic of survival. A boy, a legitimate heir, could claim the empire. A daughter, and her life and influence could be erased almost instantly. Perdiccas, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, took temporary charge of guarding the royal family. But ambition is a curious thing. and loyalty often wears thin when empires collapse, Roxana, young but astoundingly shrewd, moved with quiet cunning. Understanding that she could navigate this battlefield of whispers, shadows, and the hungry eyes of men who had once bowed before the greatest king the world had ever seen. Then came the most chilling, delicate moment of her life. To other women, daughters of Persian royalty, Startar and Parasatis claimed to be Alexander's widows. Their presence threatened everything Roxana had fought to secure. If either bore a child, her own son's claim would be null, her position precarious. And so, in a ruthless act that would echo through history, she invited the Persian princesses to Babylon and ensured they would never see the light of another day. The bodies of Startar and Parasatis were never recovered. History remembers not the crime, but the calculated efficiency with which a queen protected her lineage. Months later, Roxana gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, to the world. He was Basilius, the rightful heir to a sprawling empire. To Roxana, he was both shield and burden, a living talisman in a land where swords now ruled without mercy. She moved constantly between garrisons, always under the watchful eyes of generals and warlords, Antipada, Cassander, and countless others, each carving their own kingdom from the remains of a once unified realm. Her beauty had charmed the world's most powerful man. Her cunning now kept her and her child alive. Yet even she could not escape the inexorable hand of fate. Round 310 BCE. When Alexander IV was barely 13, Roxana and her son were quietly executed, strangled in secrecy, and buried in an unmarked grave. The dream of a united empire, forged by conquest and crowned by a queen who bridged east and west, dissolved in silence. Roxana, the little star who had once illuminated the tent of the world's conqueror, was extinguished without ceremony. And yet her story lingered, not as a tale of a queen or a victim, but as a symbol of the fragility of empires and the merciless logic of history. Through her brief, impossible harmony of love and ambition, she had watched Alexander rise to godhood and fall to mortality. She had carried his heir, shielded him from betrayal, and paid for it with her life in the end. Roxana became what Alexander had once seen in her, a bridge between worlds, destined to vanish the moment the dream collapsed. The conqueror had died conquering, his queen had died remembering, and somewhere in that silence, the empire itself seemed to sigh. After Alexander's death, the remnants of his empire teetered on the edge of collapse. Cities and garrisons that had once thrummed with the unified command of a single mind now echoed with suspicion, ambition, and betrayal. Generals who had followed Alexander across deserts, rivers, and mountains suddenly became rivals, each seeking scraps of legitimacy to crown themselves king. And at the very heart of this fractured world was Roxana, young, beautiful, and infinitely cunning. Her survival depended entirely on her son, Alexander IV. The infant was more than a child. He was a living symbol, a fragile emblem of the empire's unity. Whoever controlled him could claim legitimacy, and whoever failed to control him risked being erased. Roxana understood this implicitly. Every movement, every word, every interaction became a calculated step in a game she had no choice but to play. She was no longer just a queen. She was a general of shadows. Perdiccas, the initially loyal commander, protected her and her son, escorting them through the eastern provinces with a force that was both formidable and uneasy. She lived in gilded cages, comfortable yet constantly under scrutiny. Every letter she sent was read, every visitor watched. The empire was a chessboard, and she moved like the most patient of players. Her pieces invisible but deadly, yet the world has a cruel way of undoing even the most meticulous plans. When Perdiccas was killed in one of the endless skirmishes between Alexander's former generals, Roxana's safety evaporated overnight. She fled westward, clutching her child like a talisman, seeking refuge under Antipater in Macedon. Even in Macedon, the whispers followed her. Soldiers and courtiers alike muttered about the foreign queen, the Bactrian temptress whose child was too young to rule but whose bloodline threatened their ambitions. Alexander IV was crowned king in name only, while the cunning and ruthless Cassander consolidated power to him. The legitimate heir was less a person than a threat to be neutralized. Roxana's position remained precarious, her every move calculated to evade death, and yet, even in this maze of suspicion, she endured. Time passed, alliances shifted, and the empire continued to fracture. The boy grew under watchful eyes, a symbol of hope and a target for those who coveted power. Roxana, now more a strategist than a queen, maneuvered constantly, her intelligence and resolve her only shields against the treachery surrounding her. But fate is rarely kind to even the most careful. Round 310 BCE, when Alexander IV was barely 13, Roxana and her son were quietly executed, strangled and buried in an unmarked grave. History records it with cold precision. The empire that had promised to unite continents dissolved into petty kingdoms, each ruled by men who had once sworn allegiance to the world's greatest conqueror. Roxana's life, brief but brilliant in its cunning, had been both shield and spark. Through her love, ambition, and sharp intellect, she had preserved her legacy long enough to witness its collapse. She had watched Alexander rise, mythologize himself, and fall to mortality, and had carried his heir, navigating a world where even loyalty was deadly. In the end, she became the living symbol of empire's fragility, a star extinguished too soon, leaving behind only the faint glow of what might have been. The story of Roxana reminds us that power and survival often come at the cost of innocence and longevity. Even the most brilliant strategy cannot shield one from the inexorable forces of history. And so, as the empire of Alexander fractured, one truth remained: love, ambition, and cunning can delay fate, but they cannot ultimately defy it. For nearly a century, the monastery on Lindisfarne had stood as a beacon of peace and piety. Perched on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria, it was a place where life followed the slow, steady rhythm of prayer and study, not swords or kings. Monks in coarse wool robes rose before dawn to chant hymns in the echoing chapel, their voices carried by the sea wind. By candlelight, they illuminated manuscripts with meticulous care, the scent of salt and ink blending with the sound of gulls. Lindisfarne was a symbol of divine order, a sanctuary protected by both heaven and King Ethelred of Northumbria. The idea of danger arriving from the sea seemed as absurd as sin itself entering paradise. Yet, in the summer of 793, the horizon shimmered with a grim omen. Fishermen were the first to see it, dark shapes gliding across the water, faster than any merchant ship, sleek and long, with prows carved into fearsome dragons. At first, the locals assumed they were traders, but as the ships drew closer, the illusion shattered. Inside the monastery, life continued unaware. His scribe bent over a golden G when he heard the first distant horn low, alien sound filled with hunger. Seagulls scattered. Moments later, the shore erupted in shouts. The first wave of warriors leapt from their longships into the surf. Tall men, bearded and armored in leather and iron, axes glinting, shields painted with snarling beasts. The monks froze, uncomprehending. These were not merchants. These were raiders. The Northmen moved with terrifying precision. Their longships, designed for both speed and stealth, cut through the waves like blades. Each prow bore a dragon's face, wooden fangs slicing the air. They had crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean guided by sunstones and ravens, following whispers of wealthy, unguarded monasteries. To them, Lindisfarne was not sacred, it was ripe for plunder. As the first Vikings touched land, they raised axes to the sky and roared prayers to Odin. Behind them, comrades echoed the cry, a chorus promising blood, plunder, and glory. The monks rang the bells, hoping divine intervention might delay the inevitable. Instead, the sound merely marked their location. Within moments, the raiders were upon them. Some monks tried to flee toward the cliffs, others clutched crucifixes. Whispering psalms through trembling lips, faith offered no protection, axes cleaved doors, skulls, and limbs alike. Inside the chapel, candles flickered violently as raiders burst in. A scribe who had spent decades illuminating scripture was struck down where he stood, blood spilling across the Gospel of John. Gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, and sacred artifacts were seized. The Vikings laughed, seeing themselves not as desecrators, but as agents of their god's will. Outside, black smoke twisted into the sky as roofs burned. The raiders dragged survivors to their ships, some bound for slavery, others slain outright. By midday, Lindisfarne was stripped bare. The abbot, old and trembling, fell to his knees in the courtyard, praying for a mercy that never came. The dragon-headed prow of a Viking ship gleamed in the smoke. The mouth of hell itself. When the longships departed, the island was silent. Waves lapped against blood-stained stones, gulls circled overhead. One morning had shattered the heart of Christian Northumbria. News spread rapidly. Fishermen, townspeople, and nobility recounted the horrors. Monasteries burned, monks slaughtered, treasures vanished. Lindisfarne, spiritual jewel of the north, had fallen. If such a sacred place could be taken, then nowhere was safe. The raid was more than an act of barbarism, it was a statement. The Vikings had discovered the weakness of the Christian South, wealth unguarded, faith unarmed. Their mastery of longships meant they could strike anywhere with speed and precision. For England, it was a revelation of vulnerability. For the Vikings, it was the beginning of an age of conquest, terror, and legend. The survivors carried relics of St. Cuthbert across the countryside, their silence speaking louder than sermons. Europe trembled at the thought that the sea itself could deliver such devastation. Lindisfarne was the first roar of the Viking Age, a violent prelude to decades of raids, settlements, and cultural upheaval. The raid on Lindisfarne was no isolated incident. It was a spark that ignited an era. Across the cold fjords of Norway and Denmark, the story spread like wildfire. Young men, once content fighting over local valleys, now set their sights on lands across the sea. They built longships, sleek and shallow, capable of navigating rivers as easily as oceans. Their prows carved into dragons, wolves, and serpents became emblems of fate, warning that wherever they sailed, death or glory followed for England and the rest of Christian Europe. The attack on Lindisfarne was a wound that refused to heal. More monasteries soon fell. Jarrow, Iona, and countless others. Each raid was precise, violent, and vanished before aid could arrive. Coastal towns once secure now lived in terror. Bells, once calling for prayer, now tolled warnings. The church saw divine wrath in every wave, interpreting the Viking attacks as punishment from God. Chroniclers like Alcan of York lamented, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The heathens desecrate God's sanctuaries, shed the blood of saints from the altar, and destroy the house of our hope." Yet for the Vikings, these acts were destiny, not villainy. They saw themselves as chosen by Odin, blessed by the gods to brave seas others feared. They were agents of fate, instruments of glory. Every raid was a calculated gamble, a combination of daring, skill and cunning. Their genius lay in their longships, light enough to be dragged across land, shallow enough to navigate rivers, and strong enough to cross the open ocean. These vessels allowed the Vikings to strike anywhere. One month they appeared on the coasts of England, the next in Ireland, or even the Frankish territories of the continent. No king could fortify his shores quickly enough. No army could respond in time. The monasteries, rich with gold and silver, became prime targets. Yet wealth was not the only prize. The Vikings also seized people, men, women, and children, who were transported back to Scandinavia to be sold into slavery or ransomed for profit. War had become an economy. Kings, who ruled on land, now realized they did not command the seas. Even Charlemagne, the great emperor of the Franks, trembled at reports of northern fleets prowling coasts far from home. He ordered the construction of watchtowers and fortified coastlines, but he knew the truth. The Vikings could strike anywhere. Europe, once confident in its order, now faced a new kind of enemy. The raiders were not constrained by borders, laws, or armies. Their speed, stealth, and ruthlessness created a psychological terror as much as a physical one. Coastal communities fled inland at the first sight of a black sail on the horizon. Monks revised prayers, asking divine protection from men who seemed unstoppable. Tales of giants and demons became common. Children whispered of warriors who could not be killed by ordinary weapons. The Vikings' fame spread faster than their ships, turning rumor into legend. Yet beyond the fear and destruction, the Viking Age reshaped Europe. Trade routes were established, settlements founded, and cultural exchanges initiated, albeit violently. What began as sporadic raids evolved into permanent presence. Norse communities, markets, and influence stretching across the British Isles, France, and beyond. Lindisfarne had been the first roar, a single morning that presaged decades of upheaval. From that strike, the Vikings built an era defined by daring navigation, military genius, and the unyielding pursuit of fame and fortune. The monasteries and towns of Europe would never be the same. What began as a raid of terror became the crucible in which northern culture, economy, and identity forged themselves into legends that still echo across centuries. Europe had learned a terrifying lesson. The sea was no longer a boundary, but a highway for destruction, and the Northmen would not be denied. The age of the Vikings had begun, not with a treaty or declaration, but with fire, blood, and the unrelenting roar of dragon-headed ships cutting through the mist. They were a storm. Every raid brought new converts to fear and awe alike. Churches overflowed with terrified peasants begging for divine mercy, while poets whispered that the end of days had arrived, for the first time since Rome's fall. Europe felt small, vulnerable, and unprotected. The Vikings had discovered the West's greatest weakness, its peace, and turned it into a weapon more terrifying than armies. To understand the Vikings' fire and fearlessness, one must glimpse their world of gods, where glory mattered more than life itself. They were not driven by greed alone. Fate, or weird, had already written each man's destiny. Cowardice could not delay it. Courage could make it beautiful. Death in battle was not to be feared, but welcomed. Those who fell with weapons in hand would feast in Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain, among heroes forever. Before setting sail, war bands held ceremonies blending reverence and brutality. Offerings of mead, animals, and sometimes human captives were given to Odin, Thor, and Frey. Smoke thickened the air, chants echoed, and the Gothi, all priest, cast runes into fire to read the god's will. Omens mattered little, if favorable or not. They sailed anyway, for to defy fate was the greatest sin. This spiritual armor made them Unstoppable, the monks of Lindisfarne saw only savages. The Vikings saw themselves as warriors fulfilling divine destiny. Every axe raised, every altar desecrated, was both battle and offering, blood for a gold, death for a glory. Their mythology fueled endurance, in a world where even gods were doomed at Robnark. Life was a brief spark. To live timidly was worse than death. To die memorably was to cheat oblivion. Europe's comfort was no match for men who measured success. In legend, to the monks, they were damned pagans. To themselves, they were chosen, guided by Odin's ravens, protected by Thor's hammer, destined to carve their names upon the world's bones. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Their courage defied gods. Memory outlasted death. And fear was for slaves. The gods of the north hungered for offerings. And their faithful delivered. The raid on Lindisfarne was more than an act of violence. It was a collision of civilizations, Christian Europe, with its monasteries, relics, and written wood, met the Norse, worshippers of war, thunder, and eternal glory. The longships brought swords, but also a worldview, one in which motion, action, and memory mattered more than passive obedience. The monks believed salvation lay in patience, devotion, and prayer. The Vikings believed it lay in courage, audacity, and immortal songs sung beside roaring fires between these two cultures. Understanding was impossible. Only fire existed. Northmen discovered gold, land, and divided kingdoms. Monks discovered unrestrained fury. Over the years, raids multiplied. But Lindisfarne remained symbolic, the first awakening, the North's announcement. Chroniclers painted it as divine punishment. Norse poets sang of courage and Odin's favor. It was the sword against the cross, the saga against scripture. Those centuries would pass before integration occurred. Lindisfarne marked the first contact between these worlds. Even long after the ashes cooled, Europe trembled at the name Lindisfarne. It became myth. A test of faith, and a lesson: no coast, altar, or crown was safe. To the north, it was triumph, the first mark on the map of destiny. The Vikings, once raiders, would eventually settle, trade, and intermarry, reshaping Europe. Yet the memory of that day, the dragon-headed ships through mist, remained its beating heart. Long before the shadow of Rome reached the Balkans, the Aryans lived in harmony with the rhythms of life, death, and renewal. Fertility was sacred, not merely the production of children, but the pulse that sustained the world. Every blooming field, every river, every birth was a thread in one great cosmic weave. The Aryans, mountain people, herders and warriors, understood life as connected humans, animals, and land bound together in unseen threads. Storms, thunder, and rain were divine expressions. Fertility was celebrated with feasts, dances, and rituals to honor unseen spirits of the soil. Women, mirrors of the earth, held sacred roles as nurturers and participants in these cycles. Fertility deities, often represented by serpents, bulls, or women with exaggerated features, embodied creation itself. The serpent symbolized endless renewal, shedding its skin like the earth sheds seasons. A sacred metaphor for life and death. At the center was Pren, goddess of love, marriage, and sunlit growth. Offerings of flowers, honey, and milk were placed on altars. Fires burned atop hills in her honor. Behind her loomed darker, earthier spirits, goddesses of soil, caves, and decay. Fertility required light and shadow, life and death. Creation rested from sacrifice. Men, though fierce in battle, bowed to these goddesses. Women bore their image in tattoos and amulets, ensuring the divine flowed through their veins. For the Aryans, sexuality was sacred, a ritual reenactment of cosmic creation. Men represented sky, sun, and fire. Women embodied earth and fertility. union mirrored balance, not dominance. Blessing the land and ensuring continuity, festivals marked the seasons, spring dances, fires, offerings of milk, honey, and grain, sacred union sometimes symbolic. Sometimes physical renewed life itself, tattooing marked women's coming of age, fertility, and spiritual maturity. Spirals, diamonds, and serpent motifs were not decoration but divine seals. Connecting generations and honoring the Earth Mother, men bore serpent and solar motifs, symbolizing vitality and strength. Love, fertility, and pleasure were intertwined with the sacred, uniting mortal and divine. The earth and human body were one. Passion was prayer. Desire was worship. Burial practices echoed this worldview. The dead were interred with offerings of grain, milk, honey, and serpents. Symbols of eternal life and regeneration. Death was a return to the earth, not finality, fertility. Birth and decay were part of a sacred rhythm that bound generations together. Though centuries have passed, Aryan traditions endure. Folk rituals, embroidered symbols, and holy wells echo the ancient faith, even when the church overlaid new beliefs. The spirit of the Aryans persisted. Life, renewal, and desire remains sacred. Their legacy reminds humanity that creation demands passion. Life flows through union, and the divine lives within earth and flesh alike.